Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here. And I want to say a thank you to the European Lung Foundation and to Amelia and Myrona for the chance to talk to you about some of the updates in research for bronchiectasis and PCD. So before we begin, these are my disclosures. So I do a number of clinical trials and work with pharmaceutical companies, government agencies, and others in the fields of bronchiectasis and PCD. They're listed on the slide, and I'm going to talk about some of the results of those studies. So it's important that you're aware of that. And I'm going to talk about research, which means some of the things that I'm going to talk about aren't available as yet. So if you're thinking about, what does this mean for me in terms of my treatment, always discuss anything with your doctor. I thought I would start with where we are at the moment with the treatment of PCD and the treatment of bronchiectasis, which is one of the main complications of PCD. And if we look at, we've got a big European registry called EMBARC that looks at adults, and there's more than 600 adult patients with PCD who've very kindly given their data to that registry. And we look at what sort of treatments people take on a daily basis. Around half of the patients take an inhaled steroid or a bronchodilator. That's a type of medication that opens up the airways. Just under a third of patients take a regular antibiotic, either as a tablet or a nebulizer, and patients take a number of different medicines to help clear mucus, like hypertonic saline. So there are treatments, and some of these treatments have more evidence that they work than others, but there's clearly a need because of the number of chest infections that people have and the symptoms that people have for us to find new and better treatments. So it's often said that PCD is an orphan condition, which means that it's one that hasn't had enough research. Probably the most famous orphan in books and films is Oliver Twist. So from a treatment point of view, I say, please, sir, can we have some more? We do have some treatments that work for PCD, and because of really strong research networks, particularly in Europe, there have been trials in PCD. And one of the most successful was a trial of an antibiotic tablet called azithromycin. You can see here 49 people with PCD received azithromycin, this tablet, and 41 got placebo. And it included both adults and children, which is really important because studies often don't include children. It's important we also develop treatments for children. And this showed that exacerbations, which are worsening of the condition, were cut by more than 50% with this treatment. So it's a very, very good medication for people that suffer from frequent chest infections, but we need more. And so when we're thinking about the kind of treatments that we could be looking to develop in the future, of course, it would be wonderful if we could develop a cure for bronchiectasis and a cure for PCD. And in PCD, because the cilia not working is the key problem, a treatment that would restore cilia function would be potentially a cure if it was used early enough. In the meantime, because it's a long road to develop that sort of treatment, we also need to be thinking about treatments that address the major problems that PCD patients have, and that's infections, the inflammation in the lung, excessive mucus production, and loss of function of the lung, the ability to breathe. And those different aspects of the disease are sometimes called the vicious cycle, or the different aspects of the vicious cycle. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the new treatments that address infections, inflammation, and mucus. And then I'll put all of the pressure on Professor Lobinger, who's coming after me, to tell us about how we're going to get cilia working again. So the first thing I want to get across to you is that this is a really encouraging and hopeful time for people that have got this condition. The history of bronchiectasis and PCD, one of the main manifestations of PCD is bronchiectasis, is it was first described in 1819 by a French physician. But the treatment for this disease really didn't start to develop until the 1980s and the 1990s. The first discovery of PCD-related genes in the 1990s. And it remained an orphan condition until very recently, when a lot more attention has been paid to bronchiectasis, and there's been an increase in the number of randomized trials and also registries that are collecting data. This is really important because it's not enough for doctors to just say, I think this works. We have to prove that medications work so that they can be incorporated into the health system. And so the thing at the bottom right, the box at the bottom right, shows you over time how from having only one trial in the 1990s, we've now got dozens of trials in the 2020s. Most of the trials involve randomizing people to a group where you get a medication, or a control group that usually gets a placebo, which is a fake medication. I think most people who are on the call will be familiar with this idea of a randomized controlled trial, but I thought I should just put this up so that we all know what I'm going to be talking about over the next little while. So some patients will receive the real medication, some patients will receive the placebo. And in most trials, the outcomes, which aligns with what patients tell us are most important to them, are reducing chest infections, improving symptoms, improving lung function. So what are the latest clinical trials, and what do they mean for patients with PCD? Well, let's start with mucus. And one of the biggest problems that we have in PCD is that over time, because the airways are inflamed, the body makes more mucus glands, and so you produce more mucus on a day-to-day basis. And that's illustrated at the bottom here. I'll get the laser pointer up. There we go. So the little red dot showing you what I'm talking about, these extra mucus glands that are big, and they produce lots of this green mucus, and that's what patients cough up on a day-to-day basis. And it becomes very dry and dehydrated, so it's hard to shift from the airways. What you get then is dehydrated mucus. So one of the treatments that we often use for bronchiectasis and PCD is trying to hydrate the mucus, and inhaled salt, also called saline, is one of the things that we can use. And one of the largest, most recent trials in PCD was trialing hypertonic saline and another medicine that aims to hydrate the mucus, called which is involves a channel called ENaC, a sodium channel. So it aims to put more water and salt into the sputum. And this was trialed in a somewhat complex way. And so I'm not going to go through this in great detail. Either the combination of the two treatments, the salt by itself, the ENaC drug by itself, or a placebo. And what the graphs at the bottom show is that there was an increase in lung function when you gave the combination, and in both FEV1, which is how much you can blow out in 1 second, and FVC, which is essentially a measure of how big the lungs are. So this is some encouraging data that clearing mucus out, a bit more mucus out of the chest, can improve the lung function. But it's not, this is, in terms of the magnitude of the benefits, not the breakthrough that we would hope for. But hydrating mucus may be something that can help to improve patient symptoms. So the combination of two medications seem to make mucus more watery and improve lung function. There's some larger studies going on at the moment, not specifically in people with PCD, but in patients with bronchiectasis, which allows also patients with PCD. Hypertonic saline, which is the salt, plus a tablet called carbocisteine, or those individual medicines by themselves, or none of those medicines. And this is a UK trial called the CLEAR trial that's been going on since 2019. It's just finished, and the results will be being announced within the next few months. So that's going to be quite important, because if those medications work, they will become much more widely used around Europe for people who've got bronchiectasis, including PCD. So expected to report the results within the next 3 months. So moving on to infection. Infections are really important in people with PCD. We know again from our registries that those sputum tests that patients hand in on a regular basis often grow bacteria, even when patients feel well. And in people with PCD, Pseudomonas, which many of you will have heard of, that's what's illustrated in the top left here, is about twice as common compared to people with other types of bronchiectasis. But that bug in particular is one that damages the airway, and so we want to try and get rid of it or prevent it if at all possible. And there are a number of medicines that we already use in clinical practice, and in Europe the most widely used in antibiotic through a nebulizer is called colistin. The second most common is tobramycin, often given through nebulizers like the ones below. But there's a big variation across Europe in terms of how often these are used, because we haven't got a lot of big trials that show how effective they are. And so not everybody has access to these things. There are theoretical advantages to giving antibiotics through a nebulizer device. Anyone who's taken a course of antibiotics by mouth or by injection knows that there's side effects associated with that, things like tummy upset because the antibiotics go everywhere in the body. So there's advantages to putting it in the lung and only having effects in the lung. There are disadvantages as well because sometimes putting things in the lungs makes you cough. So the next trial I'm going to show you is the results of the largest trial so far in inhaled antibiotics. These are the PROMISE-1 and the PROMISE-2 trials. They were conducted all over the world. One group got antibiotics via a nebulizer and one group got the placebo. Then we saw how many chest infections people had over the course of a year. And the results are shown here. So this followed on from a phase 2 trial of this same inhaled antibiotic, colistin, through the nebulizer. And what you can see on this graph, this is a typical graph that's used to show the effectiveness of a treatment. Anything to the left of this line means that the number of chest infections for patients were reduced. And if I put up the summary numbers here, a 34% reduction in chest infections. PROMISE-1 showed a 38% reduction in chest infections. And then prior to the pandemic, PROMISE-2 showed a 27% reduction in chest infections. And then very interestingly, during the pandemic, when chest infections went down and a lot of us behaved very differently, there wasn't an effect on chest infections, but that might be understandable given how many other things changed during the pandemic. So giving an antibiotic through a nebulizer, we have stronger evidence for now, and it is part of our guidelines as something to offer to people who've got these Pseudomonas infections. But again, we could do with more treatments for Pseudomonas, and Pseudomonas is common, and not everybody can take antibiotics or will benefit from antibiotics. And so there are also developments going on developing new treatments. Some of you may have heard of phage, which is currently in clinical trials. And there's also a trial that's just completed using an antibody. The animation at the bottom left here is showing an antibody binding to a bug. That's part of your body's natural immune system, and that can be boosted using an artificial antibody or one that's been prepared specifically to target Pseudomonas. And so this trial called GREAT-2 is testing that antibody against placebo. This trial includes some patients with PCD and other types of bronchiectasis and will report in the next few months. Again, exciting times with more treatments on the horizon. So the last thing I'm going to talk about in my presentation is inflammation. We think about PCD as a disease where we're really focused on the cilia, and that's right, because that's what drives the disease. But that impairment of cilia means that bugs accumulate and inflammation happens. Inflammation is where your immune system overreacts to things. And cells called neutrophils are very important in that overreaction that we see in the airways. And that causes a lot of the mucus and the risk of chest infections in people with bronchiectasis and PCD. And when we compare people with PCD to patients with bronchiectasis caused by other things, the level of inflammation is higher in PCD. So there's obvious reason to think that an anti-inflammatory drug might work in this condition. And a new type of treatment called DPP-1 inhibitors, also known as cathepsin C, has been shown to block this harmful inflammation that we see in these diseases. So I can now tell you the results of the largest ever trial in people with bronchiectasis. This is a really big trial. Over 1,700 people took part. 2 doses of a medicine called brensocatib, which is a once daily tablet, were tested against a placebo over a year. And again, like all of the other trials I've shown you, the number of chest infections was the main outcome, but they also measured lung function and symptoms. It was carried out all over the world, so 5 continents, 35 countries, 391 trial sites. And as I said, it's important that we also think about treatments for children, and 41 adolescents were included in the study. 136 of these patients had PCD, making it the largest PCD trial that's ever been conducted to date as well. And this is what the results showed. So there was a 20% reduction in the risk of chest infections, in also called exacerbations, in people who took the 2 doses of brensocatib. There didn't seem to be a difference between the 2 doses on exacerbations. So that's being shown here. That's the number of chest infections over the year in the placebo group, and that's the number in the patients who got the active treatments. In terms of lung function, this is really important because we want to make sure that people don't get worse over time, and lung function gets worse over time in people with bronchiectasis and PCD. And we saw a reduction in lung function in people that got the placebo, and similar in the 10 milligram group, but giving the higher dose of the medicine seemed to stop people from getting worse after about 16 weeks, resulting in a significant slowing down of the progression of lung function change, which is really encouraging for a treatment that's going to be used long term. Because lung function gets worse slowly over time in people with PCD, as you age, lung function goes down faster if you have PCD, and it goes and it probably early in life is when you lose the majority of the lung function. So it's also encouraging on the right-hand side that when we look at the effect in adolescents, so in young people who are taking part in the study, although it was a small group, the reductions in exacerbations in adolescents were at least as good as we saw in the overall study. So this looks like a treatment that is likely to be available in health systems in the US and Europe in the next couple of years, and seems to work across the spectrum of lung disease in bronchiectasis. It's not the only type of this anti-inflammatory medication that's in development. There's also another similar compound that's in development and just completed a phase 2 study. Again, all types of bronchiectasis were allowed into the study, but PCD accounted for 8.4% of the participants in this trial called AirLeaf, which was 322 patients. And this treatment also showed a reduction in chest infections at 2 doses, 2.5 milligram and 5 milligram, reduced the risk of chest infections by 30%. So it's really encouraging to see several treatments that can reduce symptoms, reduce exacerbations, and slow down lung function decline in people with bronchiectasis, including PCD. And there's a new trial of this medication that's starting early next year. So anyone who's interested in research, ask your doctor about whether they're participating in that study. It's a really exciting time from a development of new treatments point of view. After decades of not having new treatments, there's new antibiotic treatments in development. There's new anti-inflammatory treatments that are likely to become available to patients within the next year or two. We're going to hear shortly from Professor Lobinger about gene-targeted therapies. And in the future, it's hoped that we may even be able to prevent lung damage or reverse some elements of lung damage, as has been seen in some patients with cystic fibrosis. So the future is really bright when we start to think about the developments that we've seen in research. This is just a list of some of the ongoing trials in bronchiectasis. And this is where I would make the point that having PCD patients taking part in studies along with other types of bronchiectasis is bringing big benefits to people with PCD, because a lot of these drugs would not be trialed only in populations of PCD because the numbers are too small to give statistically significant results in PCD by themselves. So the future for PCD therapy is really bright. We've got new treatments for inflammation that should be available soon. We're hopefully going to have new alternatives to antibiotics. And the goal of all of this is to improve patients' quality of life and reduce things like exacerbations while continuing the search for a definitive treatment and we hope one day a cure for the condition. So I hope this gives you some enthusiasm and positive feelings for the future, because I really do think we're heading in a positive direction. I want to finish by saying thank you to everybody who's taken part in research, whether you've done a clinical trial or just taken part in the registry. The research contribution only happens because of patients that are willing to volunteer their time. And you really are doing something special for your fellow patients when you take part in research. Thank you to the team in Dundee who've helped to conduct a lot of the studies that I've just shown you, and all of the funders who have supported these trials that I've just shown you. Thank you very much.